In some ways, the Huawei P30 Pro's camera system is completely groundbreaking. Let's get into it. Okay guys, welcome to maybe the most exciting smartphone camera comparison of the entire year. We've got the Huawei P30 Pro, Galaxy S10 Plus, and the iPhone XS Max. And let me know which smartphone microphone you think sounds better. So we're recording 4K video from the rear cameras, and weirdly enough, Huawei's P30 Pro doesn't support 4K video at 60 frames per second, so we're recording at 30 on all of them. Now, one of the most exciting things about this new Huawei flagship is its 5x optical zoom, and honestly I had to see it to believe it. All three of these phones have optical image stabilization on the telephoto lenses, so even when you're zoomed in this much, the footage is generally pretty stable. But you really start to see the differences when you go to 10x. You can clearly read the text on the Eiffel Tower. I am standing so far away at this point, and on the other two phones that's quite apparent. For a point of reference, the iPhone XS Max footage is the closest to reality in terms of colors. The S10 Plus is very similar with a slightly punchier aesthetic, and it looks good. But then you've got the Huawei P30 Pro, which has basically established an entirely new color palette of its own. It's not necessarily bad, it's just different. For this shot here, I put all three phones on a tripod, and I wanted to show high dynamic range. This is a really good example of how the iPhone XS Max HDR is still yet to be beaten. It has managed to control that super bright sun a lot better than the S10 Plus, which in itself has done it better than the Huawei. Now, you can also shoot video in ultra-wide, or at least you can on the Huawei and the Samsung, and it's such a cool feature to be able to get that extra perspective. But what you will notice is that, especially in video, Samsung's ultra-wide captures so much more. Ultra-wide are definitely the right words to describe it. I'm happy to say that all three smartphones have stellar stabilization. Here I'm walking in 4K resolution, and the Samsung is lagging a little bit behind, but nonetheless, all three do a pretty good job, and there's no weird distortion effects that we've seen on previous flagships. But things get really exciting when you bring that down to 1080p. This is when Samsung's super steady video mode kicks in, and that elevates it quite a way above the iPhone. But then, Huawei's P30 Pro combines artificial intelligence stabilization with optical image stabilization, and the results are crazy. I don't think I've ever seen anything quite like it. This is quite possibly the best smartphone stabilization to date. One of the things that I've really enjoyed about the last few Huawei flagships are these AI video modes. Things like AI color, being able to colorize the foreground and make black and white the background. And they work better on this phone than ever before. I just wish they'd added a few more. Now, Huawei's slightly weaker dynamic range in video is really apparent here. The P30 Pro does control the bright areas in the sky better than the Samsung, but you can also see that it almost crushes the blacks. The general image just looks dark, definitely darker than it should be, whereas the iPhone in particular looks quite balanced. I'm happy to say though, this changes in low light, and the Huawei becomes a bit of a beast of its own. Its image is a little too warm, but the detail is miles above the other two phones, and grain is lower. Bear in mind that on the P30 Pro and the S10 Plus, you do also have the option to use the ultra-wide for nighttime video, and it is great to have the option, but you'll probably never use it because the quality takes a complete nosedive. Back to the main camera though, the Huawei manages to consistently produce far less grain than the Samsung, and a much brighter picture than the iPhone, making it the best smartphone I've ever tested for low-light video, and things are about to get a lot better. So, just before we dive into photography, this is the setup I was using, and there's a couple of things worth pointing out about the smartphones we're dealing with. The iPhone has two cameras, a wide angle and a telephoto. The S10 Plus then dials this up by adding in an ultra-wide lens on top of that. And then the P30 Pro has not just 5x optical zoom versus 2, but also adds a fourth camera, the time of flight, which should mean much better portrait mode. So let's find out. First things first, the P30 Pro has the best nighttime shots of any smartphone I've ever used, providing you use the night mode, and you're happy to hold the phone steady for 4 to 6 seconds, the results are sharper, brighter, and generally cleaner than the competition. As with night video, the general trend here is that the S10 Plus is a little grainy, the iPhone is a little dark, and although it does look a little processed and over-sharpened, the P30 Pro leads the pack. Also, whilst having to hold the phone still for a few seconds to take a nighttime shot can be a bit of a pain, and it can mean that moving objects like cars are blurred, this doesn't seem to happen any more often than on the other two phones. They too have to keep their camera shutter open for a long time at night to let more light in, but they don't have the night mode software to cope with it. You can also use night mode whilst zooming in. So if we take this scene, zoom in 5 times, you can see that Huawei preserves the texture of objects much better, and to the untrained eye, it's not even obvious that it's nearly pitch black in this scene. Okay, this right here is one of my favorites. You see that Eiffel Tower way off in the distance? Well, if we use that 10 times hybrid zoom on the Huawei combined with night mode, the result is leagues ahead of the other 2 flagships. It's almost funny. You can also use the ultra-wide cameras on the Huawei and the Samsung at night, and the results are better than when trying to take an ultra-wide video, but there's still a noticeable degradation in quality versus the primary camera. Alright, this is when my jaw practically hit the floor. This is the inside of my hotel room at night, with no lights on. I could barely see, and the iPhone's image is about the best way I can describe how dark it was. Samsung's bright night mode did activate here, and it's brighter but less sharp than the iPhone. But the Huawei completely blew me away. I remember when the company was announcing this phone, and they talked about how it's more sensitive to light than even full-size DSLRs. And I was skeptical, but this really is the real deal. The flash quality is good on all 3, but I did find that Samsung doesn't color correct so well when it's relying on the flash only to light the subject, and its images have a slightly green tinge to them. Alright, so when you're out and about in the daytime and you're just shooting standard photos, all 3 are amazing. Great detail, punchy colors, and the ability to deal with all kinds of harsh lighting. The main difference you'll see is just in the ability to handle dynamic range, and in this aspect, the iPhone is still slightly ahead. I do like the darker shadows, that high contrast look you get on the 2 Android phones, but there are some situations, quite a lot of situations, where the iPhone prevents overexposure, but the other 2 kind of struggle. Don't underestimate the zoom on this new Huawei phone. In fact, it's even more potent for photography than it is for video, and you can get super clean images even at 10 times zoom, where the other 2 phones are effectively crippled. You can clearly read text on buildings way into the distance, and I've actually used this phone's camera as a telescope a couple of times already, just to read signs that are too far away, which, I know, it sounds like something straight out of a commercial. Also, the ultra-wide cameras on the Huawei and the Samsung, they shine in broad daylight. You don't have any of those noise problems you get in low light, and notice again, the S10 fits a good deal more in the shot than even the Huawei. Apple is crying in a corner at this point. But then when you jump over to portrait mode, you've got to hand it to Apple. It's a little annoying that it uses the telephoto lens, so you have to take a step back or you end up getting this super close-up photo, but the results are consistently cinematic, and the background blur you get is easily the most natural. You might also find that the 2 Androids in portrait mode tend to crush the blacks. You lose detail in my beard, my hair, my black jacket, whereas you can quite easily see that stuff in the iPhone. Remember though, the P30 Pro now has that 4th camera, the time of flight, and this is one of the areas where it kicks in. When it comes to edge detection, the P30 Pro is a leap above the P20 Pro, and it now makes even fewer errors than the S10 Plus. If you wanted to try portrait mode at nighttime, then it actually holds up reasonably well. It's a little more vulnerable to overexposure in some of the brighter parts of the image, but not bad at all, really. The Huawei P30 Pro has yet another trick that no one's really talking about: macro. It can get so close to subjects and still retain focus on them. This is followed by the S10 Plus, which can also get pretty close, and then the iPhone, which really struggles to get close at all. What about detail? What about if you just wanted to take a shot and be able to blow it up to as large a size as you wanted? Well, the P30 Pro can shoot 40 megapixel images versus 12 on the S10 Plus and iPhone XS Max. To be honest though, a little underwhelming. This sensor needs perfect lighting conditions to really get good results, and without it, you're probably better off with the S10 Plus. The actual 12 megapixel sensor is capturing more detail. Samsung also wins when it comes to the front camera video. The S10 Plus can record at 4K resolution, 4 times the number of pixels of the other 2. That's not to say its image is 4 times better, and this is definitely not the best 4K video you're ever going to see, but my vote would go with Samsung overall for this. The P30 Pro has better stabilization, but I like how Samsung can shoot video at a really wide angle versus the other 2. Front camera photos, or selfies, are probably the most subjective part of this comparison. Some people prefer beautification, others prefer pin drop accuracy. You can't really please everyone. What I can say is that the XS Max has the most consistent and the most balanced colors, and Huawei has the crispiest selfies, as you'd expect, given its 32 megapixel sensor. They can all shoot portrait selfies too, but the S10 Plus with its specialized depth sensor does by far the best job, not just out of these three phones, but any smartphone I've ever tested. It also copes much better in low light versus the other two, which quickly become super dark and super soft looking. You do get the option for front flash on all three, using the display to light your face, and the P30 Pro definitely benefits the most from this. It kinda needs this light to perform well. I'm a bit disappointed with Huawei's slow motion situation. This is a 2019 flagship, and yet if you want to record slow motion at 1080p, the maximum frame rate is 120 frames per second. The other two can record 1080p at 240, so they can record footage that is twice as slow. If you do want to record 240 frames per second on the Huawei, you can, but at 720p resolution, which doesn't hold a candle to the other two phones. It is nice that you can shoot bursts of super slow-mo like on the Samsung, but the S10 wins in terms of quality. Huawei is using some sort of software interpolation to reach this 960 FPS limit, and you can kinda tell. So, which phone do you think won? If you enjoyed this video, it'd be massively appreciated if you could subscribe to the channel. Plenty more coverage on this phone and other phones coming very soon. As always, thank you so much for watching. My name is Aaron, this is Mr. Who's the Boss, and I'll catch you in the next one.